Hello and welcome to episode 14 of Inclusive Conversations, the Westford DEI Committee's official podcast, where we highlight voices fostering equity, inclusion, and community growth. I am your co-host, Anjali Rajput, and a co-chair for DEI Committee, and today I am hosting this episode with Wendy Clyde.
Hi, Anjali. It's great to be back today, and I'm looking forward to today's special episode.
Thank you, Wendy, for being here. In this special Juneteenth edition, we are honored to welcome Dr. Robert Forrant, Distinguished University Professor and Co-Director of the History Department's graduate program at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Dr. Forrant is a renowned scholar in U.S. and labor history with deep expertise in immigration, industrial development, and regional economic change. He has taught pivotal courses on global labor issues and contributed extensively to industrial and immigration history, including significant work on labor movements. On June 19th, at the Town Common, Dr. Forrant is actually going to present to our attendees there. Beyond academia, Dr. Forrant has served as a consultant to the United Nations Industrial Development Organizations, the International Labor Organizations, OECD, major trade unions, and numerous public history projects. He has been recognized with UMass Lowell's Distinguished Professor Award by the university in 2016, and he was also awarded UMass Lowell's President's Award for Public Service in 1998. So please welcome Dr. Robert Forrant. Thank you. We are so honored to have you here today.
Pleasure to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Wendy, would you like to ask him about some questions we had for Dr. Forrant? We want to learn about his background and his contribution to our community.
Yes. Do you prefer to go by Bob? Is that correct?
Yes.
From what
Bob works really well.
Yep.
Robert was when my mother was angry with me. When I heard Robert, I knew I was in trouble. So Bob is much better.
I get that. Yep. So Bob, can you tell us a little bit about your background and what drew you to studying labor and abolitionist history?
Sure. So it's a long story. I'll condense. It's a bad thing to give historians a platform because we like to tell stories. But I actually was in graduate school at UMass Amherst in the 70s and had a house fire and lost all my research. And this was before computers and thumb drives and in the cloud, and I lost all my work. And so basically I quit school. I didn't finish my PhD, and I went to work in a really large metalworking factory in Springfield as a machinist. And I worked there for about a dozen years as a machinist and as ultimately the business agent for the union, organized workers, negotiated contracts, and then pretty abruptly the company closed. And eventually, after a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, I went back to school and did my dissertation, finished, got my PhD, and then got hired at UMass Lowell. And the work experience for 12 years, 14 years, working in a factory setting, working in an industrial setting, and seeing what happened to workers when they lost their jobs and all of the kind of community trauma that was created. I wrote my dissertation sort of looking at that in the Connecticut River Valley in Western Mass, like what happened to the valley. That was my first book, basically. And that's really why labor history always sort of was at the forefront of everything I did. I think it was that lived work experience. While I was writing my dissertation, I had 2 small children. I needed to make money, and I became a consultant to the United Nations Industrial Development Program and spent a considerable amount of time in Northern Ireland, Honduras, and Jamaica, working with small companies, machinists, metalworking companies, to try to modernize the facilities in those 3 countries. And so that helped me think more about global development and sort of that whole story. And when I got hired at the university, it was fairly easy to sort of mush the two together and turn it into an area of study and teaching.
Wow, that's an amazing amount of body of work that you have and experience that I can see played a lot into the academic work you've done. We have titled the upcoming theme for the Juneteenth event Threads of Freedom, and that comes from my chats with you about talking about cotton as a physical material that tied the Southern slavery to the Northern industry, and also freedom as a goal that connected the struggles of the enslaved people and the Northern abolitionist allies. Could you explain a little bit more about what that body of work means to you?
Yeah, one of the things that teaching in Lowell, one of the things you're always cognizant of if you're teaching history is the early Industrial Revolution, the role of Lowell in the Industrial Revolution, and the National Park and the history, the way it's presented. And lots of school kids come and take tours. Lots of adults come in the summer and take canal boat rides and tours of the restored mills. And I've always done a lot of work. I brought my students to those exhibits. And what always seemed to me not to be 100% missing, but not researched in enough depth, I think, at least to my way of thinking, is the connection between cotton and Lowell. And it became too easy sometimes to just talk about the mills and industry and not talk about, well, what's the raw material? Where did it come from? And what's Lowell's historic link to, objectively, slavery? Because by the late 1840s, early 1850s, Lowell is consuming tons of cotton a week. And it's obviously the way the city grows. And slavery as an institution is not dying out. It's growing. The numbers of enslaved people in the United States are growing. Some people, some historians, olden days, kind of the way they thought about it, well, it was going to go away by itself and it was just slowly dying. It wasn't. It was growing. It was growing in numbers. And Lowell was heavily a consumer of cotton. Not only was Lowell a consumer of cotton, but Southern plantations were a customer for a large portion of the cotton cloth that was produced in the Lowell mills. It was sold. So the irony here, the cotton that enslaved people planted and picked was sent north to Lowell. Some Lowell manufacturing facilities transformed that cotton into cloth that then was sent back south in the form of clothing that the enslaved people's owners gave them to wear. And so as I started thinking about that, it was, it sort of hit me in the face in the sense of we need to, and it's not just Lowell. Lowell's a metaphor for a lot of the New England industrial economy. There are factories around New England that are making shovels, making picks, making plows, making cotton gins, making all the material that Southern plantations need to grow and harvest their crop. The customers for the northern factories are Southern mills. And so this is interlinked in a way that I felt like it was important to get my students to try to understand, and other people when I would give talks or do writing or research or whatever it would be. And so, and finally, the other connection, which goes back even a bit further, when the trade in people was at its height in the 1700s, a considerable number of Boston area families were the mainstays of the trade. They financed the trips to Africa to grab people and bring them back to the South. And so they made a significant amount of money on the trade. And when the international slave trade was declared illegal, the United States no longer participated in it after 1806, a lot of the families that made all this money then needed to do something with the money because they couldn't keep making the money because that economic system was now at least halted. I mean, it wasn't that people didn't try to get around the laws, but in general, it was halted. And so now they had buckets of money sitting in Boston, and they said, okay, well, we'll invest in textile mills, and we'll become the industrialist entrepreneurs, and we treat them in our history books as these incredible innovators. And in some ways they were. That's true, but they were innovative. They were innovators using what I think of as ill-gotten gains, and they never much were interested in trying to make amends for what they did, and they still haven't. But that's a whole other conversation and a whole other podcast. We're not going down that road. But the Boston wealth, New York wealth, Philadelphia wealth, came from the slave trade. We can't forget that. I mean, we try, but we really shouldn't.
And what I find really interesting in my conversations with you is talking about how the Lowell mill girls, even though their livelihood depended upon the jobs that they had in the mills, they were still part of the abolitionist, doing what they thought was right in terms of civil rights, as opposed to their own livelihood. Could you expand a little bit on that?
Sure. So when most of the young women, and by young I'm talking about 13, 14, 15 years old, most of them coming into Lowell from New England communities are, when they first get to Lowell, they don't necessarily know a lot about the history, but the thing about the boarding houses, which is really interesting, they all live in company-owned housing, and so 40 or 50 or so women will be living in relatively close quarters, sleeping, eating together in a boarding house near the mill where they work, and they'll be walking to work, walking back, whatever. And from letters and things and poetry and other things that they've left behind, they begin fairly early in the 1830s talking about this relationship between what they do and the way they're treated at work and what they know at some level about slavery. And while clearly they're not the same thing, they begin to make a connection between. And so when there are petitions to end the slave trade in the District of Columbia, for example, women in Lowell, almost 2,000 of them signed the petition. When there are petitions to block the expansion of slavery into new territories in the United States later in the 19th century, they're in the forefront of pushing back against that. And they become, in Lowell, some of the leading participants in a variety of anti-slavery activities, even though you're right, their job is dependent obviously upon the mill and cotton. And really I imagine it making the mill overseers crazy, because they get all these young women and they basically get them, they think, because they're going to be very docile and just do their work and just be cute, right? And that's not what happens. Many, not all 100% obviously, but a goodly number of them become quite radical. Not only are they pushing against slavery, they're pushing for a shorter workday, petitioning the Massachusetts legislature to shorten the workday, and they're also pushing for the right to vote. So a lot of women, like the fancy word academics toss around of intersectionality, how all these issues cross over. They were intersectional before an academic dreamed up intersectional. They were pushing for the vote, pushing for an end to slavery, pushing for a fairer and shorter work week. They were doing everything. And again, they don't get their due either, in the sense of people writing about them, you know, in this really, I think, important kind of a way.
Yeah, I'm glad I was hoping you would touch upon that they felt like the women they chose young women because they thought they would be pliable and polite and just do their work and be quiet. And I think that's an important part of the story.
Yeah, I think women can be dynamite if they want to be. That's whether in the historic times or in today's times, right? We probably have witnessed that for sure. I was just wondering that how do we see Juneteenth fitting into the broader narrative of U.S. labor and civil rights history? If you can shed a little bit of light on that.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, it's only actually in the last few years that in a much more national way, people are talking about celebrating Juneteenth. In Texas, it has been much more historically celebrated within the African American community and wider communities, because when the Civil War is ending, as it's winding down, and President Lincoln signs the first Emancipation Proclamation, word doesn't get to Texas. And then finally, much later in the process, in June as opposed to April, people are, then informed that the institution of slavery, is ended. And I think that a lot of the wider sort of interest in thinking about the history, sadly, as a lot of things do, came out of tragedy, out of George Floyd and out of what happened to George Floyd. I think that was a moment in the country where not everybody, obviously, but lots of people started rethinking. We go through these episodes of where civil rights is on our mind and then we forget about it. And all the bad stuff is still happening, but particularly in the white community, it's not in our face. And so we don't pay attention to it. George Floyd was hard to ignore. And I think that basically got people thinking again in a way that they hadn't. And it's good to see that increasingly in different parts of the country, people are either declaring it a state holiday or at least on a municipal level, it's being celebrated, such as what you all are doing next Thursday. And I think that all of that, despite everything, all the other madness going on around us right now, I think that bodes well that this conversation is still taking place.
Right, absolutely. I think that in the world, when we pay more attention to any topics, when it's in the news for a short time, when it hits us, when we see that, but proactively seeking out what happened in the history, what's happening in the outside world, probably is not in our nature. And when you say that out of sight is out of mind, right? Sometimes that's what happens. We don't see it, we don't think about it, it doesn't really hit us anywhere. So you brought some really good points over here that we as a country started to pay more attention to it since George Floyd, and I think DEI committees all across the country probably were formed right around that or after that incident as well.
Absolutely.
Last night in Lowell, you did a reading of Frederick Douglass's What to a Slave is the 4th of July, and that was published back in 1852. Why was this important for you to read aloud in a historic place like Lowell, and what are you hoping the community listening would take away from that?
It's considered the speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. Douglass considered possibly the best speech he ever gave. In his autobiography, he wrote that he spent more time working on that speech than nearly any other one that he wrote. I was asked by a school in Lowell if I would participate in a community reading. So there were 18 of us who read different passages, and it was very well orchestrated, and 18 people ranging in age from 8 to 80s. Reading passages of it, and then there was a community conversation after about what it was that Douglass was talking about. And one of the interesting things that I like about doing something like that is reading something aloud sometimes has actually more impact than just kind of reading it to yourself, because when you read it to yourself, you go, at least for me, I go quickly and I might actually miss something, but when you're listening to people read it out loud with emphasis, it becomes a quite striking thing. And one of the first remarks, so I helped facilitate a discussion of the document after it was read, and one of the first questions was, did I see any relevancy of an 1852 speech for 2025? And at first I laughed because I said, don't get me started. But then we had an interesting discussion from there. The speech is in reaction to the Fugitive Slave Law, which is passed in 1850. And the Fugitive Slave Law is a demonstration to the country at the time of how powerful the South still is, and the hold that Southern political power holds on the United States of America in the 1850s. Because the Fugitive Slave Law makes it a federal crime for anybody to harbor freedom seekers. And so anybody that escapes north is subject to being chased down, caught, and returned. And people from the South, who are referred to at the time as slave catchers, can show up anywhere. They could show up in Lowell. There's a large fugitive community in Lowell in the 1850s. They're operating barbershops, grocery stores, carpentry houses. They're a vibrant part of the Lowell community. And most everybody in Lowell knows they're fugitives. And as happened all over the North, when the Fugitive Slave Law is put into effect, pretty much that entire population goes to Canada because they don't want to be, and even free blacks, even people born free, leave because you can, by the law, you can be caught and you have no right, you have no right to a lawyer, you have no right to a judge, you have no right to say, wait, that's not me. It's their word against yours, and you have no standing in the court because you're black. And so you're gone. And so people wisely leave. And the reason to read it in Lowell was Lowell became one of the few places that they had this big meeting in the city with many of the people that were involved in the abolitionist movement, came together and essentially pledged nobody would be taken from Lowell. They would harbor people, they would not turn people in, they would make sure nobody was taken. And around New England, people were being taken from Boston, from Rochester, New York, from Syracuse, from all over. Most of the people that from Lowell that went to Canada came back, and nobody was ever taken from the city of Lowell. And so it's a really important movement, I think, in the current context with, it's not, again, they're not equivalent, and I'm, as a historian, I always want to be careful. I'm not saying one is exactly like the other, but on the other hand, if you harbored a fugitive in the 1850s, you could be, and you were white, you could be thrown in jail, you could be fined $30,000, no small thing at the time, and as well 6 months to a year in prison. And so the law made everybody in America complicit in the institution of slavery. On paper, it did. And so then the question for the country becomes, are we or are we not? Are we complicit or aren't we? Are we going to disobey a federal law in the cause of anti-slavery? It's a really interesting ethical, moral, legal question, which I love debating with my students. Well, what would you do? It's a law, yeah, but if it's an unjust law, what should one do? And so reading Douglas last night, that was the conversation we were having, and that was the conversation Douglas wanted to have with the people that he gave the speech to. And at the time as well, it's important to know that in black communities throughout the North, the 4th of July wasn't really celebrated. People celebrated on the 5th of July. Mm-hmm. Or they celebrated in August, which was Emancipation Day, that Great Britain had ended slavery in its colonies in the Caribbean, and they had done it much ahead of the U.S. ever doing it. And so sometimes black communities would celebrate Black Independence Day in terms of the British colonies, as opposed to celebrating the 4th of July, because again, that's the question Douglas is asking. So Douglas is basically saying, what is this supposed to mean to Declaration of Independence? What does this mean to me? I'm not free. Yeah, so and we read it in a mill. We read it on the 4th floor of a mill looking over the city. So it was like, it's pretty powerful. It's like a moment historians live for. At least this one does.
I was sorry I couldn't be there. I was hoping to make it, but I wasn't
Next
able
year.
to. Yep, I will.
Now it's going to become an annual event.
Perfect.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. As a historian, I would say when you're talking about, you would ask some intelligent questions from your students. You would ask those thought-provoking questions. What would you do? Legal, moral, what would you abide by? What would you not? So keeping that in mind, what are the things that you may have seen, kind of misconceptions that people have about emancipation or post-Civil War reconstructions? Have you seen any kind of misconceptions, misunderstandings among your students or in the communities or with the people that you've interacted, and what are those?
Yeah, I think the way the post-Civil War period for about 10 years or so, 1865 to about 1875, there's real progress made in tearing down the slavery institutions, building up school systems, people being able to register to vote where they hadn't been able to register to vote before. All sorts of really significant changes take place in that 10-year period, 10 to 12-year period. A significant number of Black people are elected to Congress. Black people are elected to state legislatures throughout the South, mayors in certain cities. And then about 1875, sort of the clock turns backward. And the Southern white population is threatened by the advances that the Black population is making throughout the South. And all states in the South begin to enforce what historians would call Black codes, for lack of a better word. And essentially, it makes it almost impossible to vote. All sorts of other restrictions are put in place. Freedom of movement is curtailed again. No money is invested in schools. And in the 1876 presidential election, this is a very contested election in American history, one that rivals some of our more recent ones. And the Democratic candidate wins, a guy by the name of Tilden. And the Republicans basically say, no, our guy won, Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes. And the Republicans control the Supreme Court and Congress, so they can hold up the inauguration of Tilden. And so there's a backroom meeting between Republicans and Democrats. I'm not making this up. It's too wild to make up. Little background meeting between Republicans and Democrats, and the Republicans say, what will it take for you to agree to redo the Electoral College vote so Hayes wins? And the Democrats, who are the political party in power in the South, say, what it will take is you pull the federal troops out of the South and end Reconstruction. And the Republicans say, you got it.
Wow. Wow.
And poor old Tilden doesn't get to be president. And decades and decades of oppression hit the South and any people of color living in the South. And it's not until well into the 20th century that we get Brown v. Board of Education to do something about schooling. And then it's not until the mid-60s that we get a Civil Rights and a Voting Rights Act. So there's a window of about 12 years, and white people freak out. And they shut that window as quickly as they can, and the South is basically resegregated. And again, it stays that way. People fight, civil rights movement keeps pushing. A lot of the misnomer about American history is that there was no civil rights movement until Martin Luther King. That's not true. There has always been a civil rights movement, which is really what I try to teach when I'm working with my students on late 19th and 20th century history. There were people pushing for the vote, against lynching, all sorts of things. But the window, again, I don't know if the metaphor works, but the window is, or the door, whatever way you want to go, is slammed shut on racial progress. And the clock is turned back in a really violent way. And again, nothing really changes until, really, I mean, in all honesty, nothing really of significance changes till after World War II. So that's almost 80 years.
Wow. I feel like I'm back in college at UMass Lowell when I took a class that was called Main Problems in American History, and it was kind of correcting a lot of what I was taught in public school, and it just blew my mind. Yep.
It's why I when I got to college, I wasn't sure what I wanted to study, and I had a class like that. I went to Northeastern University as an undergrad, and it was, okay, my mind has just been fractured. Give me more.
Yeah.
Give me more.
Yeah.
Some people freak out and go away, run the other way, and I was like, give me more. And here I am.
All right. We are really looking forward to more conversation with you next week at our Juneteenth flag raising, and then you will be treating us to a longer presentation over at the Performing Center for the Arts right across the street from the town common.
Yeah.
Looks like a lovely room. I checked it out online.
Oh, good. Yeah.
I like looking at the spaces I'm going to be in and kind of see like how I'll fit. It looks like a place I'll like.
It's a converted church that is a cafe kind of atmosphere now, so I think you will like it. Yeah.
And then you will also get to see and probably introduce yourself for a couple of minutes at the town commons, where right after the speakers. So Westford Town Common is also a very beautiful place. I'm sure you like that as well.
Yes, I checked out pictures of it as well.
Yeah.
Well,
yes.
Thank you for accepting our
Sorry. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you for being our guest today during this podcast. We appreciate your time, and Wendy and I and the DEI members, this whole town is eagerly waiting to watch your presentation and hear your stories that you're going to tell us on Juneteenth.
I saved a few of the good ones.
Wonderful. Again, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.